So hi, everybody. I'm Sam Barlow. I've been making video games for going on 20 plus years now. If you know me or have played my games recently, you probably know me most as the creator of 3 titles that have explored applying traditional video game mechanics to kind of traditional filmed narrative. Those games were Her Story, Telling Lies, and most recently, Immortality. I kind of started doing this without a particular goal in mind. Kind of Her Story came out of some experimentation and a love of the detective story. But in making Her Story and then continuing down this path, I've kind of become more intentional in what I'm doing and started to kind of think about how it sits alongside traditional film performance, like TV and film. So I will be explaining how we might destroy movies and TV to build something better, which is a somewhat incendiary sounding title. Will be nice TV and movies. So I'll start by kind of zooming out and trying to dig into what for me has been the trends of storytelling in the previous century, and then kind of what the big shifts we've seen in the 21st century and kind of how I want to plug into that and do something interesting. So here we go. So for me, if I look back at the 20th century, and for me as a lover of cinema, I think towards the end of the 20th century, the kind of dominant storytelling form was television and movies. And when we look at those forms, something radical kind of happened in that century. And we had this transformation of storytelling that for me is encapsulated if we think about the power of broadcast. So we're starting out way back with the printing press. We had the ability to have a novelist write a story and then have that printed and distributed and spread much further than they could ever physically spread their own stories. And then across the 20th century, you had radio, the popularity of radio, moving into television, network television, and movies. And all of these forms have this incredible power that is the scale and the reach of broadcast. But a necessity of that broadcast is that they are all in essentially a fixed form, right? If you want to distribute a movie, at least traditionally, we're talking about the 20th century, you need to go shoot the movie, cut and edit it, and you'll have a final print of your movie, which will then be duplicated, physically put in reels, stuck on a truck, and then driven to the cinema so that it can then be projected, right? If you want to show a television program, you're going to write that television program. It's going to be shot at some point. It might have been live, but more commonly, it's going to have been edited again into a fixed runtime. If we think about the kind of golden era of network television, there was a very strict structure built around commercial breaks, your 5-act structure, a very rigid structure that would then enable them to broadcast that. There was the commercial necessity of particular ad breaks, certain lengths. So we had this incredible reach and power that broadcast gave us with the constraints that we have these specific fixed formats that we have to distribute them in, which is in contrast to, if you think about prior to all of these kind of broadcast media, storytelling was something that, the oral traditional storytelling, stories told through song or kind of folk tales that are passed on. Those are stories that are kind of changed in the telling. When those stories are told, it's very intimate and organic. There is a lot of performance involved. So those stories have a little bit more life to them, but by necessity, their audience is limited. And in fact, here is my favorite anecdote. that every time I tell people this, it still blows my mind. But to get an understanding of like this sea change of traditional forms of storytelling to then the power of 20th century broadcast. In the 50s, Orson Welles did a TV version of King Lear. You can see him here. He loved fake beards. That was his catnip. And when this broadcast of King Lear was shown, more people tuned in and watched that performance of King Lear on television than had ever seen a performance of King Lear in total for the entire rest of human history before that point. So, you get that this isn't just like an incremental thing. There was this radical shift from how many people could be reached by these pre-broadcast technologies, how many people would experience a story, to suddenly now with the power of broadcast, the reach of a story is incredible, right? So it has the power to create moments to touch people and create moments of connection across the whole planet, essentially. So that's very exciting. But like I say, there is this limitation. There is the requirement to essentially lock this thing down, to slightly kill it in the way that you might pin a butterfly to a board. But that comes with the technology of broadcast. But now as we head onwards into the 21st century, I think the defining feature of our storytelling is the fact that it is digital. And digital technologies bring with them even greater opportunities, right? So we have the same huge scale and reach of broadcast, maybe even more. But because they're digital, these are stories that can, in different ways, be reactive. They can have a kind of computational element to them. And kind of for me, the way as a storyteller, I get excited is rather than be on the receiving end of this mass broadcast, when I watch a piece of digital storytelling, I'm essentially receiving it as an individual one-to-one, right? Even if I'm watching a Netflix show, that's being piped directly to my house and coming through the wires and onto the TV screen when and when I want it. So we now have kind of re-enabled this direct, more intimate relationship between the story and the person that's having the story told to them, in theory. Well, what's happened so far? So if we look at the disruption that has happened with TV and movies since digital technologies became more prevalent, we can see some incremental things, right? So the shape of a given show or movie has changed. There is a debate, and it's kind of fun to ask a young person this, like, what is the difference between a movie and a TV show now, right? A 2-hour episode of Stranger Things, how is that different from a 2-hour movie? There used to be the distinction between serial programming and then like a mini season event. Now, essentially, if Martin Scorsese is putting out a 4-hour movie, the difference between that and some kind of mini season event is very kind of tenuous. So we have these tweaks to the size and shape because we're not driven by that rigid structure of commercial breaks, because we don't have to worry in quite the same way about the theatrical exhibition of things. Even the constraint on traditional movies was that there was only so much footage you can get on a reel of film, and a movie would come in multiple reels. So there was a kind of constraint there on the runtime of these things. And we've moved beyond that now, right? So you can have, in a given series of television on Netflix, different lengths per episode, depending on what the creator wants. We can have 30-minute dramas now. We can have all these different shapes and sizes. The way in which we consume things has also changed. So as someone that comes from traditional gaming, I take particularly notice of the fact that we talk now about binging, right? We have these kind of descriptions of how we consume television that are kind of similar to some of the more negative language we use when we talk about gaming, right? You might have a gaming session that is several hours long and the world disappears, right? That's very similar to how someone immerses themselves in a piece of television binging. And then we have, this is interesting to me, a layer of personalization. So And I think that the limitation here is that this mostly or almost always occurs at the kind of shelf level. So when I boot up Netflix, it will present me shows that it thinks I'm interested in, right? And it will know an awful lot about my television viewing habits, and will use that to suggest pieces of television. It will do, this always tickles me, it will change the thumbnails, right? Depending on who is logged in. So if I'm logged in, you know, it'll show me a thumbnail for The Godfather, but it will pick a attractive female B character, put that on the thumbnail because it thinks that's going to make me, as a straight man, click on it. I have been told, I think someone on Netflix told me that was often driven by the assumption that if you like a particular actor, so if you watch a movie with a particular actor in, they will kind of foreground that actor in other shows or movies, even if they're like a minor character in it. But there's clearly lots going on there. So they, you know, a lot of how we now interact with technology is heavily personalized, heavily kind of on demand. If I want to use a map now, I have a personalized digital map which knows where I live, knows the kind of restaurants I like to go to, right? It's very personalized, very much. I will ask, can you show me the directions from A to B? Previously, I would buy a giant map book which had every map in it and would be very generic. So we're used to having this level of personalization and customizable content now. And in our TV and movies, you see it, but it is just this veneer, right? If I then click and watch a show, ultimately, despite these tweaks and iterations we've seen, it's still a traditional way of telling a story. They're still conceived, filmed, and then shown to me as a linear chunk of story, arranged in linear order, episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Every single person that watches the show or the movie will get exactly the same version, right? That one of the constraints of broadcast was, if you take movies, for example, movies will be shot, edited, even before Marvel got really into this, you would have alternate cuts of a movie and you would do test screenings. And because the limitation of traditional movies is that there is one cut of the movie that gets sent out to all the movie theaters, you would test that against the kind of larger, more general audience, and you would pick the cut that played nicest there, right? But we still do this, even though now everyone gets their own personalized thumbnail, even though they know that I love this movie that has Charlotte Rampling in it. I'm not going to get a cut which has slightly more Charlotte Rampling. So we're still essentially, and this is the constraint that, as I see it, we're still telling stories in containers. And so far, what has happened with digital is that we've tweaked these containers. They're slightly different sizes and shapes, and we put nice covers on them or whatever, but it's still a story told in a specific container. And when you put in a story in a container, it essentially becomes a slightly inert, dead thing. So how do we move beyond this? Well, coming from video games, I look at what video games have become. I look at what the internet is. I look at how we interact with the internet. And the big thing that I see there is that we've essentially thrown away the container, right? If I ask you how long a particular video game is or what an experience might be, in a more open, dynamic, modern video game, that is a very hard question to answer. These are experiences which are kind of unbounded and unpredictable in certain ways. The internet has no container, right? The internet is just this sea of information that we surf and try and find meaning through and tumble down rabbit holes. So for me, the big challenge and opportunity for storytelling, now that we're engaged in digital storytelling, is to take this leap and ask what happens when you throw away the container. And I think the initial thing that's very obvious is to now think about the exploratory nature of things. And whereas a traditional video game, say, would involve the exploration of space, as human beings, as hunter-gatherers, we are very plugged into the kind of the sensation of exploration. We have curiosity. We seek things out. If you look at now how the news has changed. We used to get a newspaper, turn through each page, read most of the stories depending on our interests. I would skip the sports at the end. Now the news isn't like that, right? The news is just this sea of information and stories, and it's very modular, and I can explore. I might read a story on this website and then jump to a wiki link here and start digging into it and researching on my own. So we have this exploratory way of interacting with information on the internet. Now, story is essentially information plus emotion. It's the simplest way of boiling it down. When we tell someone a story, we give them pieces of information. And as those pieces of information are given, there is some emotion attached and generated in that process. And it's that kind of synthesis that creates the feeling of having a narrative experience, of having a story experience. So it seems obvious then that if we have now found ways and have kind of jumped into this world where our relationship to information is now much more exploratory, this is something we could apply to how we experience our stories. Rather than being sat and have a story fed to us piece by piece, we could have a more exploratory relationship. And again, this is where I kind of bring all of my games experience. And as I was making Her Story, and then the subsequent games, really started to be aware that I was using the kind of game design part of my brain, that a lot of the mechanics and the relationships to the structure of the piece was plugging into a lot of more traditional gaming things. So take a step back and ask, what distinguishes games from these traditional forms of media then? If games have an interesting approach, what fundamentally is interesting to me as a storyteller, not just as a game designer, about the experience a player has when they play a game. So we have this sense that they're inherently digital and unbounded, which, like I say, is the connection I initially made. Truly nothing happens unless the player is present, which I think is, a switch flicks in your brain. So much of storytelling is tricking the brain into thinking something is real or important. I go and watch The Godfather. On some level, The Godfather is enjoyable because I start to believe these characters are real and care about them. With a video game, just that hard sense of, well, if I don't push buttons, tap keys, nothing is going to happen. The fact that I am moment to moment, minute to minute, physically interacting with this device in order to have things happen on a level just engages my brain, tells my brain there's actually something happening in the real world here. There's like motor reflexes involved. So you already get this kind of heightened sense of involvement and reality, which is a real boon to storytellers. But then when I break down, for me, the core pillars of storytelling within video games, I have these 4 pillars. So there's challenge, which I guess is the one that's most obvious to people, right? Oh, a video game, I have to be skillful. There is challenge. But I think on a simpler level, it's less about the skill and more, as human beings, we are driven to, if an obstacle is put in our way, overcome it. So much of our psychology is tied into that aspect of the struggle of survival, that having some element of challenge, and again, it's not necessarily about skill. So in my games, we'll kind of dig into this, but that challenge might be understanding what's happening, answering the what and why of the story. And, that creates this additional layer of involvement and immersion. The second pillar, and this has been one that I think distinguishes what I've been doing often with a lot of traditional gaming narrative, is really embracing this idea that as human beings, we crave expression. We love to communicate. We love to show people how unique and special we are. And in a video game, I can express myself. The really good video games have a rich expression. So, for example, the reason that the Mario games are so successful is because Nintendo really wants you to express yourself and find joy in that expression. So the Mario games, very simply, are games about the joy of running and jumping. And Nintendo creates beautiful game systems and control schemes that makes that jumping expressive. If you watch several different people play a Mario game, they're going to play it in different ways, right? If you watch a high-level Mario player, they're going to be running and parkouring everywhere. Those games are full of secrets, alternate routes, things for you to interact with in multiple ways. So as I play a Mario game, I'm getting to express myself in this specific constraint of jumping, right? If we're exploring the idea of jumping, I am expressing myself in how I jump. And as a human, that's very rewarding. And what I've become really interested in is how do I have someone tell me a story in a way that allows me to be expressive, allows me to express myself and my relationship to that story. And that's really, if you think back to the idea of like a campfire story, or even something as simple as a stand-up comic, right? There is a back and forth. The stand-up comic will respond to the audience. They will ask the audience questions. They will customize their routine. And that involvement of the audience, that ability for the audience to express themselves, is more involving and makes things hit harder and is a really interesting aspect. So I've been really interested in how we make stories more expressive for the person that is being told the story. We've kind of touched on this, but so many video games are driven by and revolve around exploration, right? It's a key aspect of what makes video games tick. Like I say, we're a hunter-gatherer species. We are hardwired to explore the edges of our territory, to head out into deep, dark caves, into forests, to find things, to see a distant mountain and want to climb it. And that sense of curiosity and that drive, and also that ability to map out a space is very key to how we kind of experience our daily lives. So, you know, that has always been this huge driving feature of video games. And if you look at, you know, the dominant form of a modern video game would be the open world video game, which is all about freedom of exploration, empowering the player to explore freely, which in itself kind of also brings in some of that expression. And then the fourth pillar that I think makes video games unique as a storytelling medium is simulation. And I've crossed it out here because when I started out to make Her Story, I was coming off of having made a bunch of traditional 3D games with narrative focus. And I was starting to be very mindful that we get so much pleasure out of the simulation aspect of a video game, right? Again, our brain chemistry is driven to understand systems, to detect patterns. If you watch a kid playing with blocks, they're trying to understand how physics works, right? And you give them a fun little toy with bells and whistles, they're trying to figure out how this thing works. We get so much kind of pleasure from learning and educating ourselves that I became very aware in making more traditional video games that just putting the player into a simulated world and letting them play with it and test the simulation and all the affordances that gave us, that was such an inherently fun and immersive thing that it almost felt like we were using it as a prop. And a lot of the kind of really prominent narrative video games, if you looked at them and if you were being kind of critical and mean to the whole medium video games, you would look at them and you'd say, well, there's all this interesting systemic stuff going on. You know, it's very easy for us to model the path of a bullet or the way in which a vehicle works. And the player's having so much fun playing with these systems. And then the pieces of narrative are then kind of dropped in in places around this larger simulated world, whether that's a cutscene in a Grand Theft Auto or it's a tape recording in a BioShock. And so when I started with her story, one of my initial kind of hard rules was no simulation, nothing systemic. The goal was to try and create a narrative game that would have challenge, expression, and exploration, but without any of the kind of the free fun and immersion we got from simulation. Because my suspicion was very rarely was that actually plugging into the story. You know, we were maybe using it in the way that a blockbuster movie will use spectacle to distract you, right? It's not necessarily telling you the story. It's just this thing that is exciting and prompts oohs and ahs. And as an aside, kind of building on that as well, if I meet people from outside of games or even people who are deep within the world of games and they hear that I'm interested in making narrative-based video games or telling interactive stories, the assumption is always that I'm going to be making a choose your own adventure. And this is something I've kind of tried to move away from. And this is also my subjective opinion. So not to say that I think choose your own adventure, the concept, the format of like a branching narrative with explicit choices is inherently broken. But I think it has a lot of limitations, which for me limit the possibilities of what we're talking about here. Really what a choose your own adventure is doing is presenting a system. It's telling you or promising you there is an inherent system underpinning all of this. You're making a choice, and then there will be consequences from that choice. And it's promising that there's a deep system of characters and wants and needs and society underpinning all of this. But really, it's quite a simple train track. So there's this kind of lie involved in promising you this systemic richness, but really it's quite a simple, brittle thing underneath. I also think, and having spoken to people play these games, watching people play them, previous games I've made, and kind of trying to understand what people are enjoying, with a choose your own adventure and a branching narrative, you're kind of trying to get people excited by the breadth of choice. Well, like you could take the story all the way over here, or this, you know, you could make a character that's instead of X is Y. And audiences actually get less excited by that. Whereas if you talk about depth, and I think when we think about exploration of story and digital stories and the possibilities, depth is really the key, right? I think there is only so far you can go in a 90-minute movie or a traditional network TV show, whereas the unbounded nature of a digital story, the real possibility there isn't saying this story could become anything, right? And it becomes vaguer and more nebulous. It's saying, here's the story we're telling, but we're going to let you go deeper. If you're really interested in this character, right? You're watching Breaking Bad. Wouldn't it be nice for a certain section of the audience to spend more time with Walter White's wife and see more of her perspective and have that element be richer, because it's not fighting the demands of a specific network TV show with a protagonist and an A-B storyline. So for me, the choose your own adventure does not give you the depth, right? It's offering you breadth instead. I think as a storyteller as well, I'm very mindful that so much of the emotional charge comes from specific choices. And if you build your story around each choice being variable and not set in stone, you do start to, as a story, not necessarily from the experience of the player, but as a storyteller, you do become disconnected from some specific instances of how that emotion is engaged and how you interact with it as a storyteller. So really, in rejecting choose your own adventure, I am much less interested in what if we did this instead, right? What if instead of murdering his uncle Hamlet did this? What if Macbeth did not listen to the witches? And instead, getting into the why, because the why is the really fun bit of storytelling. If you look at how stories are so much more sophisticated now than they were 50 years ago, right? If you 70 years ago, if you watch say a cop show from the 50s and compare it to a cop show now, so much deeper and richer. The psychological depth of characters is so much more. The complexity of the crimes, mysteries, motivations is so much more. So the audience is craving this depth and this richness, and why questions are so much more interesting. And I really, when I set out to make Her Story, I kind of did this deep dive into the detective story. And this was where I really kind of came face to face with this, of seeing the evolution of the whodunit, the classic whodunit, which has, you know, the very simple detective character, and it has a narrative that's essentially a puzzle. And the question is the what, right? Who did the murder and how did they do it? And then you see this evolution where it becomes richer, and it goes to the how done it is kind of the Columbo era, where we actually tell the audience who committed the crime at the start of the story. And now they have this interesting dramatic irony, and now there's much more emotional complexity. And the audience, it's a more complicated relationship because the audience knows things the detective doesn't. Whereas in the classic, the audience is just sat there waiting for the detective to explain everything. And then you see the evolution from the Columbo kind of how done it to the why done it is the modern form, right? And this is your serial killer dramas. This is your Scandinavian noir cop show. This is the kind of murder mystery to the point where all of the tropes and required elements are there, but the audience and the creators are kind of saying, look, this isn't as important. The puzzle element is as important. We just want to go really deep into the psychology of somebody. What led this person to commit this crime? Or in the case of something like True Detective, you know, the big shift in True Detective was that actually the two cops were the people whose brains we were going inside. And that show did not really care who committed the murders, right? There was a token kind of reveal at the end, but ultimately that was a show that wanted to go deeper and deeper into the psychology of its two cops. So for me, the Choose Your Own Adventure is not giving us the opportunities for that richness. So instead, let's talk about how we can use gameplay to explore story, particularly in the last 3 games that I've made. So if you haven't played them, I started with Her Story, which was a game about a woman who possibly has murdered her husband. The game takes place on a computer desktop in a police database, and you explore hundreds and hundreds of pieces of video taken from her police interrogations over the course of 7 interrogations. And you discover new pieces by typing in words, and the database will then spit out clips in which the woman uses those words. So you have this exploratory experience as you start to map out the story, discover things, think of new words, names, places to search for. So I followed this up with Telling Lies, which was a kind of subverted undercover cop story in which you are seeing footage that has been secretly recorded across the course of an FBI investigation. And this is footage taken from the webcams of several characters who are enmeshed in each other's lives. And at any given point, you're only watching one of the webcams involved in a dialogue. So you're always seeing one side of a conversation and then piecing together the rest of the conversation, finding the other side of it. And this takes place, this story, across 2 years. And you kind of crisscross, jumping around clips from across the 2 years. And it's very much about relationships and how we remember them, how we hold together, experiences that we've subsequently kind of realized were not true. It's called Telling Lies. There's lots of people lying to each other. And it was really about exploring the texture as well of the idea of surveillance. So the pacing of it is very non-cinematic, very exploratory. The way people talk in it, you know, you have people in relationships who are comfortable with silence, who might not talk for a while or just, you know, speak in unspoken ways. So it has this very uncinematic texture. And then most recently was Immortality. This was a game in which you uncover footage from 3 movies that were shot in the 60s, 70s, and 90s. And none of these movies was ever finished or released. And the actress who starred in all 3 movies, Marissa Marcel, has disappeared. And so your initial hook is what happened to Marissa Marcel. And the way you do this is by watching footage as if sat at a moviola. So you can scrub through the footage and kind of really pour over it in the way that the film editor might. And at any point, you can click on any piece of imagery on screen, whether that's a character's face, the dagger they're holding, the flowers in the background. And the game will then create a perfect match cut to another piece of footage. So there's this interesting back and forth kind of dance that you have with the game, where you're kind of expressing what is interesting and the game is taking you, following that thread, but often surprising you. So you create these kind of interesting montages yourself that allow you to explore these different pieces of filmmaking and kind of put together multiple stories, the stories of the movies, the stories of what's going on behind the scenes, the stories of what really happened to Marissa Marcel. So you kind of continue to kind of dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the story. And all of these projects satisfy these core pillars of gameplay in useful ways. So the challenge bit, I think, is fairly obvious. All of these games start with a question that gets you in. That's the hook, the mystery. Did this woman murder her husband? In the case of Immortality, what happened to Marissa Marcel? And then as you start to answer that question, you will discover new questions and impediments to your understanding. Well, why did this happen? Okay, now I understand this piece of the puzzle, but now I have some much more interesting questions. And, you know, because of the nature of having to seek out and discover the clips within these different gameplay mechanics, like there is this sense of you having to work to overcome the friction to discover and put together all these pieces. So there is an inherent kind of challenge there. And then in terms of expression, and again, I think this for me is the key distinction between these games and say a more traditional, very linear, kind of fixed narrative game, or even a kind of choose your own adventure narrative game where you have very simple binary choices, which don't have the richness that I think is required to really kick into this feeling of expression. So in her story, you can type any word and that will pull up these different clips. When you're watching, you're listening to what the woman is saying, you're listening to the words she's using, you might pick up on a particular turn of phrase. You might hear or discover a new character name that jumps out and sounds interesting to you. So you have this huge freedom to decide what to search for next. That, you know, what is important to me in this story? Is it, oh, well, she's talking about this character, that's really important. Well, hang on a minute, I think that maybe this character is having an affair, so I'm going to type the word affair, right? You can sit with a partner and play this game and have different theories. You can suggest elements that are not even in the text, right? You watch people play her story, who are trying to be clever, and they'll be like, well, this is a murder mystery, so I'm going to search for weapon. Oh, maybe somebody got stabbed with a knife. I'm going to search for knife, right? People trying to kind of second guess. There are kind of big reveals inherent to the story of her story that people can anticipate. So rather than the story drop a twist on you, you can actually put that together in your head and then search it out. So you have this very rich, free, expressive relationship because of the joys of natural language, because of the richness of the natural language, because of the genuine freedom that's in there. In Immortality, this match cut mechanic is incredibly freeform. You can literally stop any piece of footage at any point and click on anything that is in focus and is on screen, and we will generate the match cut. So it allows you to, again, be very expressive of, oh, I'm really interested in this character, Carl. Show me more scenes with Carl in it. Oh, I get there's this religious theme running through here. So I'm going to click on the crucifix. I want to see some more crucifix stuff. And I'm going to really dig into this thematic underpinning of the story. You know, people might try and be clever and be like, well, oh, I want to see more footage from this movie. So I'm going to click on the camera assistant from this movie, because that's always going to take me to shots that were shot from this particular movie. People love clicking on coffee cups and weird little props as a way of trying to maneuver into kind of more obscure pieces of footage. So you have this very free-form expressive thing as well. We really push this on Immortality. We try to recreate the experience of using a moviola. So the act of watching is itself expressive. You can essentially DJ the footage. You can slow it down, scrub it forwards and backwards, freeze frame, frame advance. So the kind of joy that a film editor has, or you have if you're in the room with a film editor, of really scrutinizing footage and getting really into the nitty gritty of it, right? Like I love, if you're cutting a more linear project, looking at different takes that an actor has done and then picking like, what's the frame we want to cut out on here, right? And then you, frame by frame, you're looking at this performance and you're scrutinizing it. And it's such a joy to have that proximity to an actor's performance. So that ability as a player to not just sit back and have the film projected at you 24 frames a second, but to be in control of that, to be sat at the controls, is itself expressive and joyful. And then something that people really got stuck on with her story was this idea of sequence breaking, right? So in a Metroid game or a more open traditional game, sequence breaking is when you as a player outsmart the game and you do something that allows you to break the anticipated flow of the game, right? So in the case of Metroid, making clever use of jumping and bombs to climb over a higher wall that you shouldn't be able to get past yet. And as you play the Metroid games, as they go on, the designers become aware of this and they're almost encouraging you to do this. And I think there's nothing more expressive as somebody who's consuming a story than jumping ahead in the story because you want to, because you've actually got ahead of the storyteller, right? And again, this came from mystery stories where the most frustrating thing in a mystery, and particularly an interactive mystery, is if you've already figured it out, having to wait 20 minutes for the story to acknowledge, okay, this is what's happening. You're like, yeah, I know, I got that 20 minutes ago. So then beyond the concept of mystery, just any aspect of the story, like if I want to hit the gas pedal and I want to jump ahead and I want to get to this bit and I see where this story is going and that's exciting, I want to get there. That's very expressive, to have control over that kind of larger structure of the story. So these are all ways that the games really expressive pieces of game making, down to the kind of game feeling controls of how you scrub the footage, the mechanics of choosing how to navigate by clicking on things or typing words, down to this kind of meta structure of, well, I'm in control of this experience because the structure is allowing me to jump ahead and jump in all sorts of directions. Exploration, as we've already said, is key to all these experiences. And really what I've been doing more mindfully since her story is thinking about how exploration works in a traditional video game. The use of locks and keys, of gaining abilities or skills that allow me to traverse in different ways, the way in which a Metroid game will allow me to backtrack to a previous area with a new power, so I now navigate it in a different way, and I'm building up this more sophisticated, layered kind of appreciation of these areas, and over time building a mental map in my head of the world. How does that fit to a story? Well, as you gain understanding of the story and the characters and the themes, those are all keys that unlock understanding of other pieces. So you might return to a piece of footage now knowing XYZ, and suddenly this makes so much more sense. Or you can put these two pieces together and now you have a much deeper understanding. And as you play my games, you build this mental map of the story and how things fit together and the chronology and all these aspects of it. So very much building on how a Zelda game or a Mario game or a Metroid game deals with exploration and space and the player's journey through that space, and applying that to the storytelling. A lot of that is based on the freedom that we give people versus a traditional story to see things in the order they want to see them. There is this thrill. So if you think so many video games, Grand Theft Auto is about the thrill of driving a car faster, more legally than you would in real life. Mario is about running and jumping further and faster, more joyfully than you would in real life. And the thrill of my games is the thrill of traversing a story faster and with kind of more superpowers, right? Being able to teleport. And Telling Lies go from this beat here to 2 years in the future and then back again, right? Have this ability to jump around in the story, get a more kind of dimensional view of it. And then obviously this is these gaming pillars give you this incredible involvement as a player, really supercharge your imagination. And on top of that, you have the story itself. So we're still telling a story which inherently has all of the excitement of how a story might traditionally unfold. So, I think this is a pretty good model. And really, to reiterate, the place this gets you to is in a containerless world, plot stops being the spine of your story. That plot structure, I think in the background of this slide, you can see the various diagrams people will use in Hollywood to explain their 3-act structure, the story ring, the story triangle, the story quadrants, whatever, the hero's journey, all these traditional structures that are essential in a traditional setting. If I want to go and see a 90-minute movie, I'm going to sit in the cinema, and maybe it's a 3-hour movie, maybe it's the new Avengers movie, and it's 3 hours long. I'm going to sit in the cinema and face forward, and I'm going to have to ignore the fact that I'm hungry. Maybe I need the bathroom. My neck is getting sore. I'm essentially denying my physical body. The seat's maybe not great and comfortable. I'm staring at a 2-dimensional screen, pretending it's a 3-dimensional world. This is a very hard thing, right? So the filmmaker is constantly having to keep you engaged, and plot is how they do that. Constantly, what happens next? What happens next? What happens next? What happens next? Right? That is how you keep people engaged. In this world of video games, we have these other affordances. We are interacting. We have the challenge, the expression, the exploration. So we don't need that rigid plot thing to keep our eye on the ball. So we throw out that as the fundamental kind of organizing principle of how we tell stories. If you do that, how as a writer do you hold this thing together? How do you know that you have something cohesive and structured if you don't have your beautiful hero's journey or 3-act structure to show off? Well, but my method is to think about the other things which are inherent to why I'm telling this story. And I have this kind of system, my method of needing 3 things. And these become the thing that binds everything together. And so that'll be theme. What is the idea we're trying to explore with this? So her story was very much about identity, the difference between our internal and external self, how those are shaped by the environment. What is the emotion I want to impart? What is the very specific emotion I want to impart to people? So in the case of Telling Lies, it was, what does it feel like when you've been in a relationship that has gone bad and you have memories of when it was good, right? The honeymoon period. And those memories are still there and still real and genuine. And that way, it's not even bittersweetness, like the way our brain is able to hold these things together, of knowing this thing went bad, having these happy memories, and how you kind of hold that together in your head. With these emotions, it's usually important that there's something I can't express usefully with words, because then that's the justification. And then really importantly, there is the metaphor, which I think replaces to some extent genre in say a traditional movie. So the idea here is finding something that becomes, it's essentially like the mechanic and the metaphor, and it explains your relationship to the story. So for example, her story, the metaphor was that moment in a police drama where the detective is sat at a computer and they've run out of leads, they've hit the end of the road, their boss has told them tomorrow we have to let the guy go free or whatever. And they're looking through the police database, just looking for something. In like an older movie, they'd be going through a microfiche of newspapers in a library, and then they find like the one little clue that suddenly, boom, reopens the whole thing. Right? Everybody recognizes that beat of those traditional stories. And that was the metaphor in her story, was, well, we're going to take that becomes your game mechanic. It becomes the metaphor for this exploration of this character's history. And if you have all three of these things, when you've finished and you've created this big sea of story for people to explore, there is a guiding principle, and you can show it to people and they'll immediately get what their role is in this thing, right? You show people a bit of footage from her story, they get, oh, I know how this works. I'm going to be searching and trying to find clues and do all these things. You show them a bit of immortality, they get, oh, I'm watching old pieces of film and I'm scrubbing through them to discover these little behind the scenes moments, and I get how this works, and I get the magic of the kind of cinematic cut. So it's, the metaphor really is, like I say, it's in the way that genre prepares an audience for, like, what kind of story will I be getting? What tropes are we going to be exploring? What would I expect to happen? I think having in the kind of more unbounded space of an exploratory story, having this central guiding metaphor, I think, is really useful. In the case of Telling Lies, it was the surveillance job. It was understanding, like, oh, when someone's being surveilled, there's lots of watching kind of empty domestic things that you get. There's a limited frame, right? If I'm spying through a window, or if I'm listening to a wiretap, I don't see the whole picture. That became the kind of metaphor for Telling Lies. And then with immortality, I will get onto that. Let's go 5 minutes left. So yeah, this is how I applied this method to immortality most recently. So we started with this huge ambitious theme, which was, why do human beings tell stories, right? We wanted to look back at the history of movies and the struggle of making movies, and use that as a jumping off point for asking big questions about why we tell stories. Is it to create an immortality project, right? Do we create stories so that something will live on beyond us? Is it a direct consequence of our mortality? So lots of big, chunky, ambitious questions. The emotion, this picture in the background here, is a game I worked on for 3 years that was cancelled. That was a huge struggle. The emotion was that idea of, like, well, if we tell stories to achieve immortality, if we tell stories to create something that lives beyond us, why, like, what is this irony that sometimes we will almost kill ourselves to get these stories told? Like, working at scale on a big game or a big movie, it's so demanding. The struggle is always there. Like, for me in immortality, the job was to communicate that emotion of what it feels like to be so invested in this story that you're telling, and the struggle of it, and the impossibility of ever really achieving your goal. And then the metaphor was this idea of, like, imagine an editing suite and the Moviola machine, this wonderful clunky piece of mechanical technology for viewing film, is sat there, and maybe there's an editor to help you, and you come in and someone dumps bins of footage from these lost movies, and you're picking out pieces of footage and you're putting it into the machine, and it's all clicky and clacky and mechanical, and then you're whirring and rewinding and scrubbing through it and slowly piecing together this jigsaw puzzle. So it was really important that we had the analog feel, the mechanical feel of the Moviola, to try and communicate that sense. And when we were doing our initial research, there was this lovely quote. So I was obsessed with the filmmaker Nick Rogue, and he talks about in his biography how, as a young boy, he was like an apprentice at Pinewood Studios, and the first time he went into an editing room and he saw the editola, which I think is the British word for Moviola, just blew his mind. He could rewinding footage and changing the direction of time was just incredible to him. And he would sneak breaks and go in there and just play with this machine. And he recounted, I think it was like in the late 90s, that the editola was like a PlayStation for him. And like, when I read that, I was like, yes, like that sense of this mechanical toy, of the immersion and that you get, like, if we can make that connection, that'll be a really key part of immortality. And then I'm going to, in my closing minute, quickly answer the question that maybe is on your lips of, well, how do you even actually write something like this? We know how to write a traditional story, beginning, middle, and end. How do you go about creating an exploratory story? And very quickly, I will give you a sense. A lot of outlining, a lot of Google Sheets, huge spreadsheets, In the case of Immortality, we started big with, this is the story over several centuries that we were trying to tell, and then the specific instances where these movies are being made, the life of this character, Marissa Marcel. From there, we actually created outlines for 3 fictional movies, full, interesting period movies. From there, we then got the line producer to create a shoot order for these fictional movies. So actually, well, they'd have shot these locations together. So this is actually chronologically in Marissa Marcel's story, how they would have shot these movies, which allowed us to then inject the key events in Marissa Marcel's life and these behind the scenes stories that are going on. We took these stories, these outlines, put them back in a decent shape, and then we gave them to some writers. So we worked with Amelia Gray, fantastic writer who worked on Mr. Robot, Maniac, Alan Scott, who wrote one of my favorite movies of all time, Don't Look Now, Barry Gifford, who wrote Lost Highway and Wild at Heart with David Lynch, fantastic novelist. We gave them these outlines and we said, hey, you wrote movies in these periods, please go and write us a genuine screenplay of this invented movie. And so we then got back these full scripts for these fictional movies. And we then kind of treated them, and this is always part of my process as well with these exploratory stories, trying to kind of create something that feels like a found object, right? So you come at it as a writer, almost exploring it yourself. So we had these screenplays, and we then took them, put them into this shoot order. So we then had like, well, this is, in Rome in 1968, on this day, they're shooting this scene from the movie Ambrosio, where the monk is doing this in his cell. That's when I kind of injected all of the, if you've played Immortality, you'll know that there's lots of, because these are unedited pieces of film footage from these movie shoots, you'll see what was happening 30 seconds before someone's yelled action. You'll see, oh, in this scene, they stopped halfway through because something else happened. Oh, throughout this entire scene they're shooting, there's this subtext. So all of this kind of behind the scenes stuff, we injected the story of Marissa Marcel into these found screenplays that we were provided by our writers. And we're almost at the end now. The final step, and I say final step, it's like most of our time is spent in this step, is the thing I call the hologram method, which is if these exploratory stories are going to work, if the theme, the emotion, and the metaphor are going to come through, it's a very simple process. We essentially look at every single piece, every single teeny atomic piece of this. So in the case of Immortality, I think we have like 300 something clips. Each of these clips, we have this big spreadsheet, and we make sure that each clip ticks off every single thing. So that would mean, does this clip contain some information about Marissa Marcel's story at this point in her life? Does it contain something that addresses each of the themes from the game? Does it have a piece of movie making trivia, like the craft of movie making, some little detail that people might learn? All of these different categories, right? And each character who has a subplot or a plot will be in this checklist. So the idea is, if I watch this piece of footage and I watch this other piece of footage, I, as the storyteller, do not know where you're going to go, which piece you're going to go from here to here. You could be watching any individual clip and jumping through your choices to almost any other piece of footage. But if we have all these layers, in the same way that in a hologram, every piece of a hologram contains the information of every other piece, I believe. Say somebody is really interested in the character Carl Goodman. If they watch this scene with Carl Goodman in it, and we're guaranteeing that there's some useful piece of information about Carl Goodman, some shift in his story here, they can then jump off of that to another clip with Carl Goodman in it and put together essentially a story movement in the gap between those two scenes. But someone else might look at it and they're just really digging into Marissa's story. So they're following a different line of inquiry. Or somebody might be riffing on, or maybe even not even consciously riffing on some of the themes of the relationship between art and artist and the role of a muse or whatever. And because this clip contains some commentary on that and this other clip also, like they can then put these two different clips together and get a different through line. So you're basically ensuring that as people put things together in different configurations, that is meaningful. And I say it's essentially a very brute force technique of just making sure every single piece has everything in it, right? And that would, the hardest thing on Immortality would be, there are shots in Immortality that are insert shots, right, of characters picking up things. There's usually no dialogue in those shots. It might not even necessarily be the main actor who's performing the insert shot. So we would look at those and we'd be like, well, how do we find a way to inject something in here, right? So there's a shot in Immortality where a character stubs out a cigarette in an ashtray, and repeatedly the use of cigarettes and fire is a thematic threat. So we had that connection. We then made it so that in that scene, the director, John Durick himself, is using his hand to stub out the cigarette rather than the lead actor who plays Carl doing it, which is a piece of movie trivia that often, they will use a different hand for the insert shot. And as this is happening, Marissa Marcel's off camera, she's in a relationship with both the lead actor and the director. So as he's stubbing out a cigarette, she makes some comment about how Carl has more handsome hands, and you get this little sense of this menage a trois going on. So just every scene, you're like, if we can build in all these layers, we're going to be able to plug these things together in interesting ways, and that will allow the player to navigate intentionally and have a genuine story experience. And we spend a lot of time doing this, and final step is we do a lot of number crunching and algorithmic assessment of these connections between the different clips. We create prototypes, usually text-based, where we input the screenplay and the game will spit out a playable version of the whole script. So this was Immortality. We had a looping 10 seconds of Eyes Wide Shut, and it would basically print out lines of dialogue, action beats with timing, and as characters and props appeared on screen, these little boxes would appear. So you could kind of play it and initiate match cuts and get a sense for the pacing. And this is something we would never share or do tests of. This is something that I can play, and I can squint and see the vision, but it becomes a very, a playable version of the script where we can get a sense for the flow and all this kind of layering. And, we do that and we iterate algorithmically, we iterate with the prototypes until we get a final massive script, and then we go shoot it. So in Immortality, we shot for 50 days, 400 plus pages. And, that comparatively is the easy bit. That's it. That's what I've been up to. And in conclusion, like, what am I excited about next? Where do I want to take this stuff? I think Immortality, we tried out this idea of randomness, RNG, random number generator, and narrative, which is not common, right? We use randomness in games a lot. We know how compelling fruit machines are. We know that if I'm playing a loot-based game like Diablo, having randomly generated loot that is dropped by enemies makes the loot feel special. We know that there's all these interesting relationships to randomness. And there is an element in Immortality when you make a match cut, the game will decide where to go. It's not predictable in the way that some games are. And that gives it a little bit of life and surprise. And I think that's a very interesting thing to explore. Continuing this idea of the exploration of narrative content directly, giving people control over the structure, continuing to bang on about expressivity over simulation, rather than creating elaborate simulations of things, which ultimately are quite simple reflections of the complexity of real life. Find ways to create richness in how the player expresses themselves as they interact with the narrative. The ultimate test is if three different people sit down and play your game, within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, they should be in completely different places. They should be having different experiences because they are different human beings. And ultimately, like I say, the big learning for me is just lose the container. Think about all of our different media. What happens if we abandon that container? What happens if we surrender plot, structure, and that explicit control in favor of the interactivity? Thank you. I will now take questions.
Thank you, Sam. That was absolutely fascinating. I played, I think I played the last 3 of your games. I tried to play Isle actually, which is one of your early.
That's 1999. Yeah, I literally can't remember that game. I did a literary festival a while back, and they had a famous voice actor there, and the surprise was they said, "Oh, we're now going to play one of Sam's games," and they did a live play session of Isle with him reading it out, and just every piece of the prose was alien to me. I was like, I don't remember the me that wrote this thing. It was crazy.
Yeah, it's still out there, isn't it, on the interactive fiction sort of format?
Yeah, you can go and play Isle, which has a lot in common with these last 3 games in terms of its non-linearity, player expression. So yeah, there's definitely connective tissue there.
Cool. Excellent. Well, we've got a whole load of questions. I'm going to try and get through them with you, if that's okay. One of the most recent ones comes in, which I believe might sort of lead into what you're doing next anyway. May not, I might have that wrong. Somebody's asking, would it be possible for you to explore the 3D space in your films while still connecting with the narrative?
Yes, and I think that, like I say, when I made Her Story, I had made the last game I'd shipped prior to that was Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, which was a love letter to kind of 3D exploration and immersion and storytelling. And really, when I made Her Story, it was a conscious decision to move away from that to explore the other possibilities. But I am very tempted, and there's a very strong possibility that the next thing we do will return to at least on the surface, traditional looking video game where you walk a character around the space, and really trying to apply these ideas of story to that space. Because I think the idea of allowing people to have freedom of exploration of the story, figuring out like, what does that look like in a more traditional 3D game, if it's not choose your own adventure stuff. That is definitely something we're looking into.
Yeah, cool. I mean, in terms of like Her Story, Telling Lies and Immortality, were you thinking story first or game mechanic first? How did those?
Usually, like, that method I have is not far from how things kind of play out. So usually there's like the story idea floating around. Usually there's some mechanical element, structure, or kind of gimmick. Gimmick's a negative word, but like that idea floating around, the kind of emotion, and sometimes one of those 3 things might come first. In the case of Telling Lies, I wanted to make the subverted undercover cop thing. Like, I was moved and saddened by the story of a lot of the undercover work that was happening in the UK, and kind of wanted to find a way to explore that story. In the case of Her Story, I think it all kind of came together. Certainly the idea of doing a police interview investigation thing was the spark. And then once I had the mechanical idea, then the story of the character Hannah became the focus, and that really then led things from there. But usually, oftentimes it will be the mechanical or structural thing that kicks things off the most, because then I'll know, oh, this is something I haven't done before. Like, I know there's something interesting to explore here. There's a different tangent to go down, and then the story will kind of emerge from that, or grow in combination with that. But certainly, like, before the full process begins, usually you have all 3 elements, right? It's like, okay, this is the trinity that I'm building on, right? This is the story, this is the feeling, this is this kind of mechanical or structural element. So even on like Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, we knew that we were going to be using the Wiimote as a flashlight. which was going to give you kind of an into this idea of exploring and looking and understanding. We knew that we wanted this structure where you were going to be interviewed by a therapist around the whole thing. And that was like, okay, mechanically, this is something interesting and we can see how this will play out. But then it was like, okay, what is the idea? Well, if we're talking about this therapy mechanic, if we're talking about this flashlight shining a light on things, then we want to be telling a story that is about memory and suppressed memories that we're exploring. And then the emotion off of that became this cathartic beat of having a child who was suffering from complicated grief come to terms with the fact that the parent, there's a character in that who's lost a parent at a young age, and so they have an idea in their head of their parent, and there's this cathartic moment of coming to terms with and acknowledging and making peace with the fact that the idea you have in your head of who this person was is not real, like it's invented. And so all three of those, it's like, okay, that's a solid package. You can kind of proceed. So yeah, different projects, different things will come first. And sometimes I'll have, oh, this is the theme I'd love to explore, or this is a particular character and emotion, but I won't be able to plug it into the rest. And so that'll just kind of go on the shelf and wait around a bit. And then maybe I'll kind of revisit it later.
Right. Probably a more general question about games, but be interesting to know how you deal with this in your games too. Beyond the chase to win or succeed, what else brings the player back to play if they put it down or they've been distracted away? And is there any sort of feedback on designing the experiences to make them come back and experience the narrative, get more of the narrative, or if they played it through to the end, to come back again and experience it in new ways?
I mean, I think the core promise of my last three games is, and it's interesting because they don't have as definitive an ending as some games might have. And for me, I love the idea that people might put the game down feeling satisfied, but then know that they can come back on a rainy day and discover something else. So this idea of the vast amount of rich content in there, the fact that there are interesting questions to explore in the game and the narrative, that there might, you can come back and you might dig and discover something new. And like there's no filler, which I think is quite rare in video games. And this was why I loved the Zelda game Breath of the Wild. I don't usually get on with open world games, but that game, everything felt kind of handcrafted, right? If I wandered over a mountain and saw something glinting in the distance and headed over to it, usually I found something interesting. And just genuinely, like, that game was just full of little pockets of interesting, fun stuff. And, the experience in my games is you have all this content to discover that you might not ever find. But each of it is a beautiful, is a unique, special, interesting piece of content. So there's always that, if someone's put the game down, they might still have lingering questions. They might just enjoy hanging out with certain characters and living in this world, and they just want to see more of it, right, and spend more time in it. So I think that, all I can do really is, have something where the player's curiosity is invoked, where they feel involved. People tend to have very strong ownership of the stories in my games because they feel like they had a very subjective experience, and the version of the story in their head is the most important one. And I also try and make games that predominantly do live in your head as much as the game is on the screen. The real story is the one that you're putting together in your head. So even when you're away from the computer, the game is continuing to play, right? And encouraging you to go back to confirm suspicions or dig into things or kind of build out more of what you've been thinking about.
Yeah. And what as a player, what game story would you say affected you the most, or is particularly memorable as a player?
The one is quite an old one. The one when people ask me my favorite game of all time, this is the one that when I've sat down and been like, yeah, actually, it was this one. There was a game from the 1980s called A Mind Forever Voyaging by Steve Moretsky. It was a text game, and it was one of the first open world city sims, in that the premise of the game was you were an AI plonked into essentially a matrixy simulated small town America. And the reason for this was that a kind of Ronald Reagan-esque politician was enacting a political plan, and they were using this simulation to test out the plan to see if it would actually make life better. And what would happen is you would essentially, your job was to just live in this world. So you started the game with a list of objectives: go read a newspaper, have a meal out, watch a ball game, go shopping, whatever. And so you'd wander around this text simulated open city, doing stuff, observing things. And you had in the game, the premise was if you typed record, you would essentially record what you were doing, right? So then you would go back to your scientist and be like, here you go, boss. Here is a recording of me doing stuff in this simulation. And once they'd collected enough information, they could iterate and then predict the next 5 years. And so then you would get to go into the world of this town in 5 years, and then in 10 years, and then in 15 years. And the initial setup of the game is you're doing this, you're seeing how society changes, that this kind of Reagan era politics, in the short term, you're seeing things kind of improve. And so you report back to your boss and they're like, cool, this is all the information we need. Thank you. Thanks for your service. Feel free to continue to live out your simulated existence. So as a player, then you're you no longer have those explicit goals, and you're left to your own devices. So you just start to kind of wander around in this world. And at this point, you start to see things that aren't 100% great. And then through wandering around, you kickstart the next 5 years of the simulation, and you start jumping ahead, and then you start to see real swings to the right, and very, very kind of Trumpian swings in what's happening in this simulated world. And you start seeing bad things happening, and then you jump another 5 years, you're like, holy shit, like they're rounding up people, and there's this police state stuff happening. And so as a player, you independently are then like, well, hang on a minute, someone needs to know about this. And you start recording and seeking out these things. And then you, off your own back, without ever being told to do this by the game, essentially become like a citizen journalist, and then take this back to your scientist boss and like, hey, I know you guys thought everything was great, but look what's happening. And for me, like, that was such a beautiful moment of being given freedom and discovering. Essentially, the plot was something that I would discover through being left to my own devices. And then I essentially concoct this idea of like, oh, I need to tell people about this. And as well, there's a lot of agency in what do you choose to record, right? Like, you could choose that this is a significant thing. And so there's a lot of freedom there. So it had like a lot of what I was talking about in terms of the exploratory feel, the freedom, the expressivity. But, back in the 80s, like, this was mind blowing. The author thought it was going to be a huge controversy. He thought that like he'd be dragged up before Congress for making an overtly political video game. Unfortunately, it was wrong time, wrong place, and the world did not, was not up in arms playing that game. But if you go back and play it now, it's still really, really good. It's still really compelling. Really
interesting.
cool.
I've never heard of it. I will dig it out. Okay. When you were making Immortality, what tools did you use for structuring the narrative? I think you kind of covered that, but somebody's saying, what is needed from tools to make more dynamic narratives? What is needed to make tools make dynamic narratives more accessible? I mean, is there anything missing, do you think, from the kind of tool set? Or
yeah, I think I'm in the same boat as a lot of games people, in that in theory there's maybe some beautiful flowcharty clever thing, but we always just end up in spreadsheets, very big spreadsheets, which I guess is the equivalent to, ultimately, if you're writing a movie at some point, you're going to sit down with a pen and paper, and that is the most creative tool. I think the things, well, we always end up on my projects creating useful kind of tools and prototyping. The thing that we always struggle with in video games is, and maybe this is an impossibility, but like there is no screenplay. I think the beautiful thing about movies is there is an accepted standard screenplay format, and therefore there is as well like a business case for I can go and spend 5 years writing a screenplay and give it to someone, and it has value, and they can buy it off me and see how this movie is going to work in a useful way. And a line producer can kind of see the budget, right? And people get a sense of how does this movie work. In video games, we don't have a way of creating that kind of documentation that enables people to kind of get a picture, because we're always reinventing the wheel so much. But we've started to do, we have, as I kind of mentioned earlier, we'll write our stories in screenplay format, and we'll usually we can like put metadata and tags in. I use fade in, which is like a really cool, cheaply priced screenwriting software. And you can put pieces, or we'll just put in the text itself. We'll use special characters, and we can call out various metadata. And then we export that into fountain format, which is like an intermediate text format for screenwriting. And then that gets sucked into the game, and that can extract from it, oh, here's this scene with these characters, pull out props and objects that are on screen. So that kind of created our prototype for Immortality. So it was very easy to be in my writing mode of sat writing in fade in, and then stick it in the game. And I know that in the more traditional dynamic narrative sense, the company Inkle has this language, Ink, which is their kind of markup format for, again, allowing writers to sit and write essentially in a text document in a way that then all of the complexity and richness of the interactivity can be extracted. But again, like there's something about, as a writer, just being in a tool where it's words on a page, which I think keeps you in that world. The more you have to pull out and connect arrows and stick things in a game engine, I think you get into a kind of different headspace. So yeah, I don't know. I think ultimately, like, making interactive narratives is hard. So I think like the accessibility stops at a certain point, I think, because there is just a certain amount that is asked of you, right? I think the screenwriting guru Robert McKee makes a joke where he says, writing a movie isn't brain surgery or rocket science, it's much harder, right? And I think, telling a structured, emotionally resonant story is one of the hardest things to do on this planet. And, when you start throwing the interactivity in, it gets more complicated. So I just want an extra dimension. I was talking to other people about this, but like I have these huge spreadsheets, and obviously there's only 2 dimensions because it's on a 2D screen. But often I'll want to like push into the screen. I'm like, if I could have a 3rd dimension, maybe when we all start living in the metaverse, that'll be possible. But it always feels like I'm just 1 dimension short of being able to really encapsulate these things.
Yeah, I have seen some stuff that kind of does it. It's not quite as you're describing it, but there are kind of interesting things that I've seen. I'll share them at some point, perhaps. Okay, well, another question here is, how do you design the endings for your games when the order of the narrative is dictated by the player?
This is a really tricky one. When the first version of Her Story I had, I wasn't even sure if it was going to have an ending. And my kind of analogy was, well, if I go to a gallery and I look at a sculpture, like there's no ending, right? I choose, I feel like I've got enough out of this, and I walk away. What was pointed out to me was, well, if I know it's not in a gallery, someone's buying this game on Steam or whatever, but the thing that in talking to players, the thing people wanted wasn't like the definitive ending that was like, this is the end and everything has led to this, but it was permission to walk away. Like if a player felt like they had a meaningful experience, had that cathartic experience, and felt like they're in a good place, right? Felt like, okay, I've seen enough of this sculpture, I'm going to go to the next thing in the gallery. But in the context of a video game, they didn't want the nagging doubt that they had missed something, or they hadn't actually won the game in the way that they thought they had. So it was kind of finding a way to give them permission to leave. So in her story, that was very explicit. Like at a certain point in her story, this pop-up appears and it's a character in world saying like, are you ready to go? Do you feel like you understand things? And the player can say yes. And that's them saying, okay, yeah, give me that final cathartic little boom, because I feel like I've had a good experience here. And then there is like in that story, a reveal of this extra layer that does give you a little bit of catharsis going into the credits. Telling Lies, I was then surprised at how many people would still want 100% and like just extract every last little mote of stuff from the game, which wasn't how I necessarily myself played it. So with Telling Lies, we tried a trick that in some cases works too well. But the framing narrative of Telling Lies is that this woman has stolen this encrypted FBI hard drive and only has so many hours until the door's going to get kicked in to review this thing and answer her questions. So she plugs in the hard drive, and from the start of the game, you can see the time in the corner, and the time is apparently moving forward in real time. And as the time progresses, little events will happen in the reflection on your screen. So there is this sense that there is a time pressure, because I wanted to say to people like, don't worry about finding everything and being exhaustive, like just go with the flow and enjoy things and follow your curiosity. But what we actually did was there wasn't actually a harsh timeout. It was all fake, right? As you watch stuff, we would decide to increment the timer. As you unlock things, we would slowly increase the time. But then as you got closer to 6 a.m. was in theory when the FBI were going to show up. As you got closer to 6 a.m., it was like Zeno's arrow. Time just exponentially slowed down. So you could never actually get to 6 a.m. But so many players told me like, oh my God, man, I was panicking so much at the end. Like I knew I was running out of time. So I clicked the button to upload everything, and because I didn't want to like fail. So that almost worked too well. But and then Immortality has a similar thing of, well, things will escalate and then control gets taken away from you and something freaky happens and it's interesting. But all three of them had under the surface a tracking of loosely progress and understanding. So all three games would be aware of like, how much stuff have you seen of all the stuff? And usually there was a threshold around 30 or 40% of, okay, this is like enough if they want to finish things up. And then also it would usually track the major subplots. So in the case of her story, I think there were 3 or 4 subplots. And if you had seen one piece, one major beat of all 4 subplots, then you were good to go. Because you would have at least the opportunity to have answered or even know what the questions were to ask. Similarly, I think in Immortality, there's a couple of things, a couple of key questions in the narrative that it's like, oh, if the player is at least aware of these questions, if they've seen a certain amount of stuff, then we're probably ready to kick them out to the credits. It's also tracking. So in the case of Immortality, it's tracking, it knows like how dramatic each scene is relative, and it will wait until, if it thinks you're ready to go to the credits, it will wait until you come out of a dramatic scene. So it won't be like, you see a character flossing their teeth and it's like, dun, 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 the end. It will make sure it feels like there's some kind of crescendo there. And then you completely have the opportunity, once you've gone through the experience of the kind of end game, to then come back and dig in further. But in all cases, it's something we keep fiddling with. we still had the issue on immortality of people playing for like 30 hours to find every single thing. And I was like, why are you doing that? You don't need to do that. And they're like, well, there was an achievement that said you find every single film clip. And I was like, well, yeah, but that's because we have to put achievements in the game. And if we didn't put an achievement for finding every single clip, then the player that did that would be really pissed off, because then they'd be like, oh my God, I found every single clip and I didn't get an achievement. So it's very hard. I love, like, yeah, systems that don't have achievements. Personally, for my way of making things, I love, because there's something about adding that layer in which tells people like this is the way you're supposed to play. It's very hard to fight against that traditional narrative of like how a video game should play out.
Interesting. Well, I know we've got to cut out fairly soon. Is there any sort of, I just wondered if you ever play like any of the big AAA franchises games, what sort of things do you kind of chill out with or kick back with, if any?
I mean, as the most joy I get is from the big Nintendo games. I think I am planning to take the whole of May off for the new Zelda game. You know, I think it's funny because Nintendo obviously is not traditionally thought of as being the narrative powerhouse, but for me, like the way in which they give freedom and expression to the player is really magical. Whereas, you know, sometimes I'll play the bigger AAA narrative forward video games, and I will sometimes get frustrated that they will put in so much effort in some areas, right, to make it so that the rope physics is incredibly authentic, and the way that your character's weight shifts if you nudge your stick. Like, they're in some places they're like, here is this incredibly expensive tech to allow you as a player some affordance in the game world, but then the higher level expressivity is non-existent, right? It'd be like, no, this is what you have to do right now. This is going to be a stealth sequence. This is going to be a platforming sequence. Here's a puzzle. Here's a cutscene. Here's what we want you to think in this cutscene. Like, it's very rigid. And I think that possibly with my next game will be the thing I attempt to tackle. Rather than me sat there saying, you're doing it wrong, this will be me saying, this is an idea I have for how to do it. But yeah, I will consume a lot of video games, and yeah, definitely the ones that give me interesting, meaningful freedom. I love, there's a trend, I think it's a trend in like indie games to basically take a very successful AAA format and remove combat and the bullshit and see what's left, right? So Disco Elysium is a great example of, oh, let's take a traditional RPG, but what happens if we take combat out and we have to therefore enhance the richness of the story, dialogue, inner monologue, and the world becomes much richer as a consequence of that. You see it with things like, famously, like Gone Home was like, what if we did a BioShock game but we took out the combat? And naturally things blossom and grow to kind of fill the absence of the combat. So that was always my frustration working in the more AAA things, was how slow an evolutionary progress was. The genres were so rigid. It was a shooter, or it was a beat 'em up, or it was an RPG, right? Like very rigid expectations around the core mechanics and your character. So I think we continue to see things, all sorts of diversity happening in the games industry. So the more of that, the more happy I am.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Although I could quite easily keep grilling you with questions for like hours, but maybe we'll do it again sometime. Thank you so much for your time and generosity in terms of revealing your process and your thoughts and stuff. It was really fascinating, and